Okay, so the talk is about three main ideas, pretty simple ones, and then we're trying to fuse them together. One's about Courbet and his painting A Burial or None, The Artist in His Studio, and his landscape painting, subsequent landscape painting. And then the second direction is about Sensus Communis, the notion of Sensus Communis, starting with Da Vinci, although it goes way earlier, but starting with Da Vinci through Kant and Hegel. And then the third point is about Zeno's paradox, pre-Socratic thinker, okay? And so we're going to take all these things and we're going to try to make them work together. So the first point is a funeral or none, or a burial. I always call it a funeral because that's how I was first introduced to it as, but it's the burial or none is a better translation probably because it's about the burial, not necessarily the ceremony, the funeral. And this is, widely discussed, supposedly the first realist painting, which is not true, but I'll get to that in a minute. 1848 it was painted. I don't know where to stand because I'm in front of it. Okay, can everybody see the picture? Okay, so this is, I liked these pictures that people, I got them on the web, of course, and these were from somebody's travel. It seemed like you were more like there, than the normal reproductions. So there's another one, the next one's funny too, but with a girl standing next to it. And it gives you scale, because these are huge paintings. The two we're going to talk about primarily, which is The Artist in the Studio and this one, okay? Maybe I should do a quick, like everybody's probably familiar with it, but this is The Artist in the Studio, okay? Okay. And The Burial or None. So, Linda Nochlund's written about this painting wonderfully. A lot of people, it's very, first realist painting, supposedly. We're going to debunk that myth. Okay, so you've got people parading here. There's like 45 of them. Non-hierarchical structure, which is very important at the time. Jesus, who's the center of so many paintings, in the history of art, is up here out of the center, and he's in the sky, divided from the rest of the people by this distinct horizon, which everyone else is beneath. Like I say, there's no hierarchical structure because, we'll get to that in a minute, but it's partly due to Courbet's democratic principles. And everything's painted with the same sort of resolution. So this is playing off of paintings at the time which would have been mythological and allegorical, and you would have known that who the primary subject of the painting is through it. I should have examples, I guess, but we all sort of know. You would know through the composition what the central locus of the painting is, which would be somewhere in the center of your eye, would be directed to it through composition. Otherwise, here we have none of that going on. We just have people parading, and everything's painted with the same amount of detail, like, say, the socks or the dog. And the socks, by the way, are blue because this guy is a Republican, and he was for the Republic, democracy. So this is part of Courbet's point in the painting. But to me, the central part of the painting, and the most important part of the painting, would be the centrally located empty grave at the bottom here. And significantly, next to it, which you can barely see here, and I never saw until I saw the painting in person, is a skull next to the grave. So in a realistic, and this is one reason why it shouldn't be the first realist painting, a realistic painting, obviously that skull would not have been there. So it's some sort of allegorical content going on, and here in Courbet liked to play on the notion of allegory, even though he was considering himself a realist. So he's pointing to that grave, I think, with an awful lot of significance, this empty grave. And in this kind of notion of composition, what basically, that's the central sort of aspect, this emptiness is the central locus of the painting. It allows for this non-hierarchical structure because we no longer have a defining central sort of ideological thing, i.e. Jesus or some other sort of monarchy, in order to produce meaning, so then everyone sort of becomes hierarchically sort of leveled to the same level. So you have the parsons and everybody. And then, but at the same time, you have that sort of existential crisis. You liberate, but at the same time, you take away meaning. So there's nothing here defining anymore meaning except this empty grave. So we move on to The Artist in the Studio, which he painted 7 years later. Okay, that was the first one's 1848. This is 1850. The long title for this painting is The Artist in His Studio, or A Real Allegory Representing 7 Years of My Artistic and Moral Life. Okay, so it's important to Courbet. And it's also huge. These are, as you can see, it's a history scale painting, which was controversial at the time, as is the funeral painting. So they're the largest paintings he had done at the time, and I think ever did. And so I think, and this is what seems to be often ignored, is that the painting should be read together, because he's saying 7 years of my artistic life. So the beginning of that 7 years was 1848 when he painted in A Funeral or None. So what happens in this painting is that he's now centrally located himself. So he's filled that empty grave, say, in that loss of meaning, say, with himself, and he's painting a painting.
So he's active. And this painting has been interpreted in many different ways, and it's, as he says, a real allegory, which is already, at the time, and still true, I guess, a kind of oxymoron. So, you know, allegories weren't supposed to be realistic, and it's kind of like, you know, fiction and documentary. So on the left over here, this is kind of just a general reading, because this can be done many ways, but for our purposes, we're more concerned with him in the center. But on the left here is generally represented the romantic past, let's say, and the future realist, his friends over here. And then he's in the center of time, past, future, sort of orchestrating his painting, and then out the window goes like the distant future or something. That's just a general basic reading of it. But what I think is primarily important is the painter painting, and he's centrally located, and he's painting a painting. And what is the painting that he's painting? It is a landscape. So, and it's a landscape with no other definable qualities in it. You know, there's no other subject except the landscape itself, which at the time would have seemed very strange. I mean, and you would have, I mean, like, where are the people? Where are the houses? You know, where's the narrative? There's no story here. All you have is a landscape. And to get to what the first realist should be, the realist painting should be, if not Funeral 9, would be 1851, The Stonebreakers, which had no necessarily, as much as a painting can never have any allegory or metaphor, which is never really can, but as much as it can, that painting, The Stonebreakers, which I don't have a picture of, because, you know, frankly, the pictures would be the first realist, let me finish that sentence, would be the first realist painting. The pictures I have here, I've already realized, probably aren't going to match up to what I'm saying. Okay, because this is like baseball. Okay. We're on second base, and okay, so so he's filled the empty grave with himself, or the idea of the self, or the active self. Okay, and he's painting a landscape painting, and the landscape painting has nothing in it except landscape. So this would have seemed at the time, I assume, although if I was a better scholar, I probably would actually go read some of the original source criticism, but this was probably considered quite an empty painting. I mean, pretty much you can see how this leads to abstraction and sort of minimalism, because there's nothing going on in this painting, right? It's empty. It's like an empty stage. I think it would have seemed as such at the time. But, and I could go to my point right now, or I could do it later, which might be more thrilling if I wait. Make sure I come back to this, okay? Because I think it might be cool to move on to Zeno, even though he's supposed to come at the end. Because I think it would be more fun. Oh, well, okay, this is fun. I see who's up next. Okay, so if you have Courbet, I didn't know if this was going to work, but if you have Courbet painting landscape, you know, the painter painting, the notion of the painter painting, the active painter, you can see Pollock, you know, coming out of that, and you can, at the end of that sort of I am nature, Pollock, of course, with the gesture, but you can also see my favorite, oh, shoot, Bob Ross. Okay, so, I mean, pretty much, it's an illustration, and of that painting. And then Bob Ross would be sort of like, Bob Ross to Courbet would be like, say, the Bauhaus to a trailer park. Okay. Now let's go back to the serious stuff. No, that's not funny. It is kind of like I do feel like I'm at a comedy club, and I do think that this talk should be thought of like a comedy skit. That would help me a lot, actually, because some of the things I want to say I probably shouldn't be allowed to, especially when we get to the Hegel part. Okay, so we're going to jump ahead to Zeno, because I think it'll help with understanding how that landscape relates to Courbet painting, all right? Zeno's paradox, just so you know, anybody familiar with Zeno's paradox? It's pretty, like, you know, standard stuff. At least, okay, for me, personally, how I got to Zeno's paradox was a mistake. Years ago, I was trying to figure out the one-point perspective, the notion of one-point perspective, and the formula, you know, you use for that, because I was trying to do the tile thing. And I, am I on the paper? Yeah, okay. And so, you know, you try to make a horizon line, you know, and then you have the receding stuff. I can't even do it. Okay, and then, okay, how do you, what is it? Oh, I don't know, what is it? Okay, so maybe it's half again, towards the horizon, right? And you never get, and I was like, wow, that's cool, you actually would never get to the horizon. So I invented Zeno's paradox there, that was a few years ago. But it's not right for but it looks good, right? It looks like a perspectival drawing. And so I called this the perspective of desire, because you never reach that horizon and you're always getting closer and closer to it. So Zeno's paradox is basically, to do it over here, Zeno's paradox is basically if you take a finite amount of space, let's say like that, and we'll make these zeros because nothing can exist outside of that. So you have a finite amount of space, And then you can have infinity within that finite space by basically just dividing that. And this is the paradox. Like, how do you have infinity within a finite space? And you can keep doing this, you know, ad infinitum. But the cool thing is you could also do it this direction. And you could also do it then here. You know, oops, here. And you can go towards that center spot, and you could do it here. So really, the whole thing is shot through with these infinities, which if you see, if there's nothing out, if this is kind of a primitive set theory notion, anything, there's nothing outside of that. These are all zeros too. You know, it's the only way to frame that finite space. And so you have a kind of, and this is why the paradox was debunked by Plato very early on. And in fact, one of the first things that he did in Parmenides was to get Zeno in about 2 pages and disprove him. Because, you know, back in the pre-Socratic times, the notion of the many and the particular was a big debate, you know. And this was a way to poke fun at, it's possible Zeno was just actually making these as sort of a joke. I mean, that he understood that they weren't physically possible either. But although the funny thing is, in a lot of contemporary philosophy, Zeno's paradox, you see it. It comes up all the time. And I'm wondering why that is. And it may be because, Plato, through Socrates, debunks Zeno very early on in order to establish his notion of the ideals, you know, with the famous ideals, which also takes us outside of time and space, you know, and then we can lead to the whole Christian tradition and all this idea of heaven and afterlife and all that, but, you know, we don't have that anymore. So, and this is why this seems to relate a bit to sort of set theory, you know, and these notions that I don't know that well, but they also end up seeming to represent this kind of infinity within a finite space. Because, you know, you're trying to establish an interior system that has no outside, which is basically what our materialist notion is, you know. Okay, so, but how does this relate to Courbet? Okay, so right here, you know, if you do it with like this, and you have the grave there in the center, you can do the same thing, and you're always moving towards then this centrally located grave. So you kind of establish this infinite space in here. Okay, so why is this infinite space important? And to contemporary philosophy, which you know, no other than the great master himself, Slavoj Žižek, writes about it quite a bit, and in interesting ways. Of course, he doesn't mention the name because, you know, he's debunked years ago, so you can't really talk about him anymore, Zeno. Although people do, I'm just exaggerating. But he talks about it in relation to Lacan, you know, and all this stuff of the barred subject and all that, because it's exactly the way he describes it here. Is like it's this indivisible remainder is what Žižek calls it, the indivisible remainder. So it's you know, there's always that empty space. And so what happens in that empty space, I think, is important for what we're going to talk about in relation to those landscape paintings. So I'm going to come back to that conclusion. Because as Žižek says, the only way you can stop the infinite division, say, is to throw the body, as he says, or physicality into that empty space. So, and this is basically then the materialism not being just basic physical things, but it's filled with emptiness, you know, and these kind of empty spaces that one can hypothesize about, but certainly not enter. Okay, so and it's on that empty space that you can then start to like build the modern subject, and you know, relating Courbet to this idea. So you throw the body, the material space, it goes into that empty space. And the important point here then is, okay, with Courbet and these landscape paintings, then we're going back to the landscape paintings, they, where's the subject in these paintings? The subject is not necessarily on the surface of the painting. The subject is, if we look back at that early painting, the bigger painting, the artist in the studio, we see the painter in front of the painting. So when we look at this painting, we're basically standing in the position that the painter once stood while painting the painting. So our bodies have basically become the body of the painter. And we re-experience the landscape through the point of view of the painter. And Courbet was very specific and careful about like leaving a brushstroke and leaving a solid surface, you know, of marks, so that we felt his presence, you know, the remainder of his presence, which we'd all see in abstraction, you know, into expressionism and all this kind of stuff. So basically, you have this transference that occurs where his, you could say, spirit, or at least his memory, and this is how we have notions of immortality in art. And it's not that Courbet invented this, I don't think. In fact, it happens, you could say, anytime you read a book or anytime you stand in front of a painting. But he elucidates it, I think, very clearly in this transition from himself filling the empty grave, and then moving on to paint these landscapes where he's now in a very democratic fashion. See, so I mean, he leveled the hierarchies in that first painting, then he puts himself in there, but he doesn't stay there for long, because Courbet is certainly a narcissist. I mean, he even said it himself, he was the most arrogant man in France. And that was, there's a book even with that title now, you know? So, but this narcissism, what kind of narcissism is this? That's the important part. I don't think this is a destructive or a negative sentiment. Artists always get called narcissists, myself included. So I've always been trying to defend this idea, and it seems to me at some point Courbet disappears, and he disappears here. Like, yes, when his younger paintings there was a lot of self-portraits, and you know, himself in various guises and all this kind of thing, but later in his life he stops doing that and becomes very politically active. And it seems to me like it was probably a necessary stage of development. We all go through a narcissistic stage, of course, but artists may stay there longer. But, and rightly so, because eventually he disappears in this painting and we become Courbet. And this is the transition that occurs, is where Courbet embodies us, and it's kind of creepy, you might even see. When you stand in front of a Courbet now, it's like you're where he was, right? And that is, I think, what's going on in this, in landscape painting then thereafter, and the way that we relate to the artist as being central to the meanings of the paintings. But also that exchange is sort of one way. You know, that's maybe the problem, is that so Courbet embodies us, and we keep him immortal through him embodying us, but then how does it go the other direction? Which I think is something I was talking about Nathan with in the kitchen, was that, oh yeah, okay, well, Bruce Naumann's pieces, like, say, the corridor piece, where he's attempting to put you in your body, might be a similar, like, you might see that as another, sort of the end, of something that's going on here. Okay, so this will be just for comic relief. Okay, so we got Bob, and that, and okay. The note, this is not comic relief yet, sorry. Sensus Communis. Okay, so like I say, we're trying 3 basic ideas, and we're going to try to make them hang together. Sensus Communis, okay. This is Da Vinci's painting. It's not a painting, it's a drawing, and it's one of his scientific drawings, not necessarily meant to be artistic, although here is what scientific drawings looked like at the time, you know. So you can see that something different's going on here. And then hey, they'll be laughing at you, you know, 500 years from now. Okay. All right, so this is the notion of sensus communis. Common sense is how it translates, but it's not necessarily, that's not necessarily what it means. It has a long history, it goes back to Aristotle, and, oh. All right, not time for that picture yet. You're gonna get it though, it's gonna be good. I've already given it away, it's no good. I'm not a good comedian. I laugh at my own jokes, so doesn't that suck when the comedian laughs at their own jokes? All right, so the notion of sensus communis is, I think, hugely important, something that maybe you know, I'm an artist. I've done some research on these things, but I'm an artist. So, you know, I have parties to go to and things, and you know, relational aesthetics. So I'm not a very good scholar. If I was a better scholar, I think there's some real content here to explore, especially in relation to Hegel, okay? So, and I'll get to that. Okay, and I'm really going to get to that because that's important. This is important. I think the relationship of the funeral to the artist studio to the landscape, which I really don't think I nailed very well, but I think that reading of Courbet is a pretty nice one, and I haven't read it before, and I hope it sticks with you. Now, this idea of the sensus communis is, you know, like I say, I've done some research on the notion. They talk about Vico, they talk about this guy Shaftesbury, they talk about Kant, he comes up all the time, and no one mentions Hegel. And it seems to me like the whole phenomenology of spirit is sort of based on the notion of sensus communis. So I think it's, and then in Kant, he talks about sensus communis and directly in relation to the notion of taste and judgment, which is, you know, in his whole critique about artists and the notion of genius. So it's really important to artists, the notion of sensus communis, and I'll try to make that clear. Okay, so, but it starts with Aristotle, kind of, but I'm sure it precedes. But the sensus communis, the notion of sensus communis, was in the brain, and it was in medieval and classical time, and then up. And this is what Da Vinci, using the new tools of science at his disposal, that he invented, basically, to locate the sensus communis in the brain. The sensus communis at the time was thought to be where, like the sixth sense, the soul, basically, where the 5 senses came together, and it was the common sense, and it was thought to be like in the center of the brain, basically. So Da Vinci's, I mean, and you can see how, okay, you can get away with that if you're, you know, if you're drawing like this. But if you're doing this and you're actually looking at the brain very closely and you're trying to pinpoint that place, and this is what he's doing, he makes it, I mean, it disappears immediately. It's like as soon as he uses these zoo tools to locate it exactly, that notion of the soul and that common sense in that definition certainly gets altered. Although, Descartes still is locating and trying to find the sensus communis because it was meant to be where the soul is, and they thought it was in the pituitary gland, and this was important. But it was in the brain, That was important because in Hegel's case, and we'll jump over Kant and come back to him, in Hegel's case, there's this great passage about phrenology, and he seems to be simply kind of going on about phrenology, and no one seems to know why, well, I'll say, I'm sure people know, I don't. But anyway, but he's talking about phrenology, the study that sort of racist notion of like your skull bone bumps can be read, and your intent as a criminal can be discovered through these bumps. And he's like, this is ridiculous, And he's explaining exactly why, because, the brain can't necessarily have that direct relationship to the skull bone. But he doesn't completely get rid of the notion because this is one of his dialectical things. He talks about the brain growing and it needs the skull. The skull needs the brain and they grow together. So you're talking about this sort of soft material and this hard material, the bone of the brain. And then there's the being in the brain. So there's the spirit, which in the brain, which is in the bone, right? And he's saying they're all contingent and necessary together in order to create the individual, say, and he even goes so far as to say, and it's sort of a leap, that the being of spirit is bone, which of course I love if you know my work at all. So the being of spirit is bone. And he makes a kind of weird leap. Like at first he's kind of talking about it, spirit is like a bone, because if you say, spirit is a thing and you conceive of it, then all of a sudden it becomes a thing. It's like if you try to define it, you're giving it form in some sense. So he's saying like kind of that, and then he jumps sort of at the end of the paragraph and just emphatically, even in Ital, says, the being of spirit is a bone. So I'm thinking he's talking about the sensus communis here. And Hegel being Hegel, you can read for like 100 pages and not know that he's necessarily talking about the Trinity. They didn't footnote like that then, So it was kind of like, and he was kind of creating this all-encompassing system, so, you don't refer to things outside of it. So, but, he'd talk about the Trinity, and I'm like, wow, that's the Trinity, okay. So he would embed things, he might not necessarily say, Kant said this about sensus communis, I'm saying this. So, but it seems like this being in the brain is basically what Da Vinci's trying to locate here, what Descartes talks about, and then he talks about, but in relation to bone, and then he has this great passage which I should just read. Am I on time? Am I going to get the hook? This is like, 5 minutes? Yeah, we can do that. This is like amateur night at the Apollo. I like that. And Sandman's going to come get me. All right. There's the being of spirit is a bone. That part's cool. Okay, and then here's the part where he just says it right out, and which is really amazing. Okay. The being for and within itself is the essence and the subject which has a being in the brain. This being is subsumed under the subject and gets its value only through its indwelling significance. So you can only have the being in the brain if it's indwelling the body, basically. But the other aspect of self-conscious individuality, the aspect of its outer existence, is being qua independent and subject, or qua a thing, viz., a bone. The actuality and existence of man is his skull bone. God damn. I like that. Okay. All right, so basically we're walking corpses, which is great. All right, now here we're going to do it. Okay. So, and so that gets back, see, now the notion with Zizek, we're talking about throwing this body into that space, and he's certainly a Hegelian, we know that, right? So it's about this materiality, and Zizek makes a somewhat crude point about this to try to make it more clear in this book when he's talking about Zeno's paradox, or when he gets to Zeno's paradox, and he's talking about throwing the body into this indivisible remainder, and the body becomes what he calls okay, we'll call it the indivisible remainder, but it's somewhat abject and grotesque, this thing. It's just the body as amorphous form, excrement is what he says, okay? So he brings, it, not in this book, but in other places, and I really recommend, since we're on book recommendings, if you want a good Zizek book that you can actually, you know, is The Fragile Absolute, it's an earlier book, and it really gets to the core of what he's talking about. He gives this somewhat, not in this book, but a crude example of sexuality, where in pornography, where you have a camera, you know, and you get so close, thinking of perspective of desire again, you get so close to the body that, you know, apparently they have cameras that go inside the body even. And then it's just viscera and disgust, basically, and you've lost your object of desire. So the closer you get to that thing, you can get so close that it dissipates, and it just becomes just a physical body. And this is where, and you can think of Jason Bateman from American Psycho, you know, where he's killing all these people and women specifically to try to find something in the, there's this kind of frantic need to find some sort of spirit, which Hegel's located in the body, you know, somehow, and it constantly eludes. So the, you know, and Zizek makes this as an example of, I think not surprisingly, Courbet, but not through The Funeral or Non or The Artist in the Studio, but he talks about, you know, everyone's favorite, The Origins of the World, which as being the end of the tradition, the 19th century, or the tradition of the nude, basically, because it finally reveals the thing that all the nudes have been about. Except he forgot something, you know, because there's the male body too. So we have, yes. And so maybe there was something more to the nude. Yeah, this kind of, I had a stupid line that this opens a whole new can of worms about the notion of, and I figured we're all sort of tired of seeing that painting by Courbet, so I figured I'd show Mapplethorpe instead to talk about that notion of the body, okay? And this, so, okay, this is important too. Narcissist, we talked a little bit about Courbet's narcissism, and yeah, this is going to wind it up nicely, okay? Because narcissism, okay, so what's happening? It's easy to talk about this void, right, this empty space, but what's happening in there? I mean, how do you describe that, right? So we're talking about this space that's right here, you know, that's where we've got our horizon, basically, and this is what's dividing into it, right? So we're coming this way into this zero spot. And then this is the indivisible remainder, right here. And this is all the action coming into that space. And then this is the, you know, but this is that barred subject of Lacan or whatever. So this is, I think, Narcissus myth, right? So basically what you have is Narcissus looking into his own reflection. And my feeling is that Narcissus, when he falls into the water, he doesn't die necessarily, nor, but he is baptized. I being a Southern Baptist, he is baptized in this moment. So he exhausts his subject. He's exhausted his subject, and he falls into this void, which is the empty grave. Okay, so it's not, and it's what we see ourselves as in the empty grave. Okay, so when Narcissus is looking in the reflecting pool, he's not seeing himself, right? And he's not seeing himself. So he's seeing his voided, empty self, what we see in a mirror, a reflected self, which I'm saying here is that that's the view of the subject in the empty grave. You see yourself in the empty grave. I mean, it's I should get back to Senses Communis to finish that up, because so he falls in Ouroboros, like, you know, that snake that eats its own tail. So he falls into there and he becomes transformed, and that's the baptism. And that's where narcissism, I'm saying artistic or any kind of, is an important stage, obviously, and also important to investigate that self, so that you exhaust the self, and then you can become, like Courbet did in later in his life, hugely socially and politically active, and, you know, sent off in exile for his defense of democracy and equality. So, okay, so then Sensus Communis comes back, and we'll get it to Kant. And so for Kant, Sensus Communis, this idea of a common sense, okay, so how does it relate to what Kant is saying and what Courbet is saying? Kant is saying that Sensus Communis, he replaces the notion of the noumenal, which is phenomenal, noumenal. So the noumenal is the spirit, phenomenal is the objects, material. And he wants to get rid of the noumenal, says we can't talk about that, right? We're just going to talk about the phenomenal. But there has to be some sort of space left there. You have a totalized system, you know, you just have materialism with no future, you know, or no essence and no void, right? So he replaces this notion with sensus communis, which is the things that we all share and we know. It's what makes a we basically. So if you have a culture, the we, the thing that we all share that we don't even know or recognize, that's the way Kant defines the sensus communis. And it's also this thing in artistic, it's in artistic terms, it's the thing that creates taste and judgment. So genius for Kant is, this natural force, where you're still, that's the thing, it comes in touch with the sublime or even the monstrous or even beyond. And it needs to be framed and contained by the sensus communis, both in the artist and in the culture, for it to be understood, to be able to be commonly understood. Otherwise, it would just be guttural, blah, So you need the sensus communis in order to do that. So it's in the sensus communis, and this is what I'm saying, is that the empty grave, this narcissistic space that we enter into, is the sensus communis. And it is the thing that if you think about yourself in the third person, I'm wondering, where do you go? That may be where you go. You go into the sensus communis, you think of yourself as an historic figure, as an historic player, as somebody that's not finite, because you're actually seeing yourself in the third person. And often, like if you have flashbacks at death, that notion, whatever it is, I don't know, it could be a similar notion where, and I am basically advocating for this kind of notion of a sort of a subject where you're a physical being and you have your daily tasks, but you're also a historic being, a narcissistic being who's transformed, and in being transformed, once you've exhausted the self, I mean, that's, and I don't have time to go into it, a notion of genius that I think is important, because genius has been very much shat upon as a concept, and partially due to the way it was being used. But the original Greek notion is that it's like a genie. Everyone has one. It's not about, and Kant talks about genius in relation to artists, but scientists don't have it, because it's this unqualifiable thing that you can't systematize. But in order to understand an art object, I think that you exercise your genius, basically. So an artist, and that genius is that thing that's exchanged in the sensus communis. It's the thing that unites us as a we. And it's also something that's not necessarily gender, sex, or ethnic in its determination, but it is possibly some sort of universal notion of humanity. So I think, this was throwing the body into the void, and then we were back to this again so that we can really see it, and I think I'm done. Thanks a lot.